Well, the audience at the State of the Union last night was made up of lawmakers from all across the country.
But many Democratic lawmakers chose to skip it, and one viewer wanted to know if Andy Beshear's absence was part of that political maneuvering meant to send a message. Michael asked, why doesn't the governor of the state of Kentucky go to the State of the Union address? Well, here's our Victor Puente with the answer to that good question.
Well, the governor didn't go because he may not have been invited. Governors traditionally don't attend the State of the Union address. You may be thinking of the dinner at the White House with the National Governors Association. That is usually a bipartisan affair. This year, multiple Democratic governors, including Governor Andy Beshear, said they wouldn't be attending after President Donald Trump didn't invite two Democratic members. That event was held Saturday, and according to a report from the AP, no Democrats attended. As for who is invited to attend the State of the Union, first, members of Congress. All senators and representatives are invited and expected to attend. But Axios reports around half of the Democratic members of Congress did not attend last night's speech. The president's cabinet is also expected to be there, as are Supreme Court justices, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, foreign diplomats, and the president's family. Members of the media are also invited. Guests of the president are allowed, and each member of Congress is allowed up to one guest. Now, traditionally, one member of the president's cabinet does not attend. They're known as the designated survivor should a catastrophic event happen when the leaders of the United States are gathered. For this speech, that was Veterans Affairs Secretary Doug Collins. So, unless Governor Beshear was invited by the president, his cabinet, or a member of Congress, there'd be no way for him to be at the State of the Union. If you have a good question, just email us. Goodquestion@WKYT.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.